So the reason we're talking is that Ethan recently published an essay in Sources Journal called "When is Anti-Semitism Anti-Semitic? Getting Beyond the Polemics," which I read and I found really interesting. I have some disagreements, but I do think it is a kind of good faith effort to try to get at some of the questions that oftentimes I think are very destructive in the way these conversations play out. So I was really grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you about it. And Ethan, maybe you want to just start by kind of laying out the argument?
Yeah, sure. So the essay, when is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? This is obviously a question that has been on a lot of people's minds, has been the subject of heated debate. And basically, I set out, this began as a series of talks, actually, that I gave in the months after October 7th, and really as an effort to try to move us beyond polarities where many people tend to either equate all or nearly all anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or people want to draw such a sharp kind of bright red line and say these are two completely separate phenomena. I don't think either position is actually defensible intellectually or in some ways morally. And I wanted us to try to develop tools for better conversations, right? And so part of what the essay is about is showing that there's a long history to this question, that in fact there have been different expressions of anti-Zionism over long periods of time that take different forms. But before even sort of getting to that, one of the points that I make at the outset of the essay is that we really lack terminological precision in this debate. We all know about the debates over definitions of anti-Semitism, and I try not to really spend time lingering over that conversation, even though, of course, those debates are often directly about the relationship of anti-Semitism to something we might call anti-Zionism, right? But we often, in the debates about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, we don't actually know what we're talking about in terms of even what Zionism is, right? So I make a point that I know you've made before, which is that we want to think about Zionism as at least sort of two things in terms of Zionism as an aspiration, as a movement for self-determination in some form for Jews in Jews' historic homeland, and Zionism as it plays out on the ground, right? Zionism as a set of policies, as a practical reality on the ground, because oftentimes opposed positions on the question of anti-Zionism are shaped by this dichotomy around what Zionism itself is. A second dichotomy that is, to my mind, very important that I try to lay out and develop a little bit in the essay is that between intention and impact. Because so often our debates around anti-Semitism and again around anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism are people talking past each other when they're either prioritizing intention or impact at the expense of the other. And the basic point is that something can be intended to be sort of narrowly focused on critique of Israel, but expressed and manifested in such a way that can have tangible harm on Jews more broadly, or even target Jews more broadly. And by the same token, the same words, the same expression from people who've had very different relationships to the conflict. And the example I give is between, comparing someone who is a white nationalist who says Israel should not exist as part of a larger expression of anti-Semitism and perhaps a theory about Jewish control of the world versus a person whose family was forced to leave in 1948 who says Israel should not exist. I don't think you can hear those two things the same way, but I think when we're categorical in the way that we often are, that can easily happen. Where a lot of the essay then focuses is on a third distinction between what I call critical anti-Zionism and negationist anti-Zionism. And by the first, broadly speaking, I mean very fierce critique of Israel, even sometimes calls for radical reform or realignment on the ground in Israel and Palestine. But that is part of a good faith effort to engage and recognize what Zionism has been about for Jews. And I give examples that range from Jewish anti-Zionists in the early to mid 20th century, who in the pre-state era, were often people who just favored a different answer to the hardest questions for Jews and Jewish politics. Um, to people like Edward Said or Rashid Khalidi, who have been fiercely, fiercely critical of Israel, but have been explicit in recognizing what Zionism has constituted historically for Jews, and that it comes from a genuine aspiration to live freely in Jews' historic homeland, that it wasn't born of a desire to dominate on the part of most Jews, and that Israel continues to represent very important affirmative aspects of Jewish life and for many people, Jewish safety. Negationist anti-Zionism, by contrast, is much more sweeping in its condemnation of the entire Zionist project from the outset, and often affirmative that Israel either should never have existed or should go away and cease to exist today. And not just Israel, but really generally doesn't recognize the need for any kind of Jewish collective rights in whatever settlement might come that someone might propose as a radical reordering in the land. Um, I make the point that critical anti-Zionism could sometimes be part of an anti-Semitic worldview, but rarely is, and often takes pain to make distinctions between critique of Israel and critiques of Jews or even the idea of Jewish nationalism. By contrast, negationist anti-Zionism definitely is not always anti-Semitic, but it more frequently makes sweeping statements or falls into a kind of absolutist demonization of anything connected to the Zionist project, and some versions of it employ anti-Semitic tropes. And then I step back in the article, and really my bigger point is let's try to use these kinds of distinctions to engage in more conversations. And as American Jews, I want, those of us, and I still consider myself certainly a liberal Zionist. I want us to be less defensive and less afraid of these conversations. And I hope that people who are, strongly anti-Zionist can also feel there's more opportunity to open conversations if we make these distinctions, if we explain more what different words mean to us while listening to what different words mean to them.
Thanks. So I wanted to focus on this distinction between critical anti-Zionism, which and negationist anti-Zionism in this argument that, if I understand it correctly, that critical anti-Zionism is usually not anti-Semitic, but negationist anti-Zionism very frequently is anti-Semitic. And I think one of the things that I was trying to understand was the relationship between your distinction between critical and negationist anti-Zionism and the formula, which is very broadly used in kind of establishment Jewish circles, which is it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. You can hate
Yep.
Netanyahu, you can oppose the settlements, you can want a Palestinian state, blah, blah, blah. But it
Hmm.
is anti-Semitic to oppose the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. So
Right.
what is the difference? There seems to be, I want to understand the difference between that kind of distinction and the
Right.
distinction you're making between critical and negationist anti-Zionism.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. There's certainly some overlap in those dichotomies. When people say that they are not opposed to criticism of Israel, they're opposed to people who say the very idea of a Jewish state is wrong. Um, that in sort of rhetorically might not be that different. But what we see play out is that there are a whole series of kind of litmus tests and buzzwords that come to be seen as representing, oh, that must mean you don't respect the right of Jews to any kind of collective rights in Israel and Palestine, right? So you used this word to criticize Israel. I know that means you think Israel should go away, right? You use the word apartheid. In recent conversations, you use the word genocide. Even for some people, you use the word occupation. That means you don't respect the right of Israel to be a state. Oh, you're super critical of what's going on in Gaza. That means you don't think Israel, like any other state, has a right to defend itself, right? So all that kind of rhetoric gets lumped into this dichotomy in a way that I think is often really counterproductive, and that ends up being, well, actually, there's a huge amount of criticism of Israel that's fierce that you basically are ruling out of bounds. So part of what I'm trying to do, and I make the point pretty explicitly near the end of the article, is to say, let's listen to what the words people are actually using. Are they actually calling for the end of a Jewish state? Are they actually saying that they have a program that's clear? Often people don't have a program that's clear. Now, people should listen to the words they're using, and sometimes words land really badly and they imply a program of elimination. And I think people should care about when words land that way with many Jews. But the point is, I want us to open a wide space for people to be very critical and even to propose major realignments on the ground, so long as people can say, I understand what Zionism is about for Jews. I understand why collective rights and recognition are really important to Jews. Now let's talk about justice. Let's talk about all of the ways in which Palestinians are being treated completely unequally, and how are we going to get to individual and collective rights for Palestinians, and what compromises are going to be inevitable. And there's certain political arrangements that I think rightly scare Israelis and Jews more, and that sometimes sound like they are completely negating any collective rights for Jews. And those are in a complicated, sometimes gray area with respect to the distinction between critical and negations. We could talk about those. But so I think that this framework actually invites a much more capacious understanding of what is fierce criticism versus actual denial of any right to exist.